I don't think that Mao was the sort of leader who lost any sleep over masses of people dying. I think that he was different from most of us. Mao, I think he saw death as a natural result of history, and he had seen huge amounts of dying both before he came to power and after he came to power.
Cultural revolution is being removed from the historical memory of people. Today in China, you barely find anything you want to read about the Cultural Revolution in libraries or in areas of discourse.
When Mao gives a directive in the Cultural Revolution, the young people were following that directive because Mao was a godlike figure to them, higher than their parents, higher than their teachers, higher than anyone else that they recognized as an elder. And so Mao superseded all of that. And people acted in tragic but opportunistic ways to do whatever they needed to do to survive.
And yet, Mao is everywhere. He's at the Tiananmen Square, he's at libraries, he's at bookstores, he's at schools, universities, and everywhere. Do you think that people want to remember him still as a godlike figure, but forget everything that he did?
All the debates we're having about, is the Chinese economy in crisis? Is China going this way or that way? What is China's relationship with India? What is China's relationship with the United States? We wouldn't even be having any of these debates without the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. None of these things were relevant back then. Nobody took China's economy into account. China's economy had no significance. Part of why they still revere Mao, despite everything that happened, is that they're aware of where China stands today versus where it stood 100 years ago. There are Maoist groups all over the world. They call themselves Maoist, but they're not Mao. They're Maoist. That's number one. The second is that it doesn't always mean that they want to have a cultural revolution or that they want to do exactly what Mao did as a national leader. I think they talk about Maoism more in the spirit of what kind of society they would like, in which all people can find joy in their national pride, in which there are no natural or accepted divisions between the rich and the poor, in which everybody is freed, men, women, different ethnic groups, and so on and so forth.
In the Cultural Revolution, there were millions of people who underwent violence, who turned on each other. Many people died. And Cultural Revolution is considered like the churning of China, in which people still look back at that period with horror. What drove Mao to the point in which he saw this happening and didn't want to stop it?
I think Mao, the Cultural Revolution very much revolved around Mao and his imperatives and the things that he said were important. And as I said before, you have Mao both trying to cling to power, Mao who believes ideologically in the idea of a permanent revolution, that the communist revolution can never rest, and then a Mao who is sort of has a revolutionary temperament, right? This need to have a revolution going on and never be able to just rest in power, stay in power, govern in any conventional, normal way that would develop the country.
Can you go in a little bit more detail about the Cultural Revolution for all the people who don't understand what it was?
So the Cultural Revolution begins in 1966, and for context, 1966 is only a few short years after the end of the so-called Great Leap Forward, which was disastrous for China. Millions of people died in famine. And the idea in 1966, Mao launches the Cultural Revolution, arguing that China has become decadent, China has forgotten its communist principles, that China has once again become a class society, which is exactly what they were fighting against. And by that he meant that certain people who had power, had entrenched themselves in power, began to enjoy the trappings of power at the expense of the people. And so he said, no, we need to purge ourselves of that and go back to our roots. And that's the official beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And they called it cultural because it wasn't overthrowing a regime. It was more about changing the people's mindset, people's ideas about society, and to really understand and to re-educate themselves about what China was supposed to be about in this communist Maoist world. And so what they actually did was a complete upheaval of authority. So it was primarily directed against party leaders, against elites, against artists and intellectuals, against academics, professors, teachers, scientists, everyone who had higher education, everyone who had expertise in different domains, and young people in particular were encouraged to challenge and attack their elders. So you see in universities, high schools, the students would go out and beat up their teachers or hold kangaroo courts and put them on trial for subversiveness and humiliate them. So it was also seen as a youth revolution against the older generation, but it was quite violent. People would denounce each other. They were encouraged to turn in family members. And then the main thing that happened was to send countless amounts of young people from the elites of the cities to the countryside for re-education, to work in doing the things that were supposedly the masses were supposed to be doing, like building farms and digging ditches and finding water and doing draining pipes, things like that, and people spent years like that, and also adults were sent out into the countryside. Some of them never ever came back. And so the idea was really to transform China, to teach elites how to be ordinary people, and to give a chance for ordinary people to achieve power. And in fact, the Cultural Revolution, once it starts winding down, you see that a lot of the people who later on in China become very important, subsequently to Mao and even to the present, are people who went through the Cultural Revolution, survived it, and even benefited from it.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So the people who survived it ended up being the ones who got back into power. But to understand the dynamics of it, what pushes a person who has been living an ordinary life to pick up arms and turn on maybe their family? Could it just be ideology?
I don't think ideology explains that degree of passion, that degree of violence, and also especially the families breaking apart in that way. I think this is a very intriguing moment in history, because many scholars have written about the Cultural Revolution, trying to explain it, and it's very difficult for us to fathom that degree of upheaval and violence and conflict. So I think one thing we need to take into account is the position and the place of Mao in Chinese society and in Chinese culture, just how godlike it was. Imagine God himself coming down from the sky and telling you what to do. A lot of people would react like that to that with such astonishment that they would do anything that God told them to do. I think that is a little bit how Mao had an effect on people. So when Mao gives a directive in the Cultural Revolution, the young people were following that directive because Mao was a godlike figure to them, higher than their parents, higher than their teachers, higher than anyone else that they recognized as an elder. And so Mao superseded all of that. So there was definitely a godlike, cult-like following that Mao had that pushed people to act in this way.
Do you think it was also that the young people can be easily molded, and it would have been much harder to convince intellectuals, as was called in his era, to turn against family members or to turn against people that they considered their friends, their comrades?
I think that it's easier to get young people impassioned, but I don't think it's easier to trick young people than older people. I think it's also can be quite easy for politicians to trick older people. And intellectuals are not necessarily, they might be intellectuals and they might be well educated, but that doesn't necessarily make them brave or principled. So I wouldn't make that distinction. Where I think it's important, the distinction that I would make is that there are a lot of people who acted not ideologically, not because they were impassioned, but because they were trying to survive. We are human beings and we are wired to try to survive situations. And we are willing often to sacrifice a lot to survive. We'll sacrifice people who are our friends, sometimes our families, people who are close to us. And people acted in tragic but opportunistic ways to do whatever they needed to do to survive. So they turned on colleagues. They were trying to cling to whatever way they had to manage the situation. So I think that what you have in the Cultural Revolution is also always an element of simple, bare survival. And that means that people will then do unspeakable things to each other in order to survive. And I don't think that this is unique to Chinese people. I don't think it's unique to China. I think we see it in many different places in the world. I think it's a human tendency that we have. So I think a lot of what we see in the Cultural Revolution is really an element of, okay, Mao, you could die at the whim of what Mao is saying. So what do I have to do to prevent that? Well, I'll do whatever Mao says, and I'll try to prove that I am the most loyal Maoist. And the way to be the most loyal Maoist is, for example, to denounce the most people. To expose the most people as subversives, and even if need, I would punish those people myself just to prove fealty to the leader.
Considering it from the perspective of Mao, you're a national leader, even though you're a revolutionary. You believe that this is what the country needs to go through to build a classless society. But at what point, like with so many people dying, was there ever a point in which he thought that maybe this is the time this should stop?
I don't think that Mao was the sort of leader who lost any sleep over masses of people dying. I think that he was different from most of us in that sense. Most of us would, death, mass death certainly would horrify us. It would maybe make us change course and so on. I don't think that was what was driving Mao. I think he saw death as a natural result of history, and he had seen huge amounts of dying both before he came to power and after he came to power. So I don't think that had a major effect on him. I do think what happened was that after the first few years of the frenzy of the Cultural Revolution, he began to, around 1970, 1971, he began to wind it down a little bit. And he began to wind it down not because of too much death, but because it began to have a very detrimental effect, as he saw it, on China's position in the region and in the world. China was very weak economically and militarily. It was at the risk of being invaded by the Soviet Union at the time. It was very isolated. And Mao was afraid of completely losing the people who were demoralized at that time. And so that's also the time when Mao began the so-called opening up of China. In 1972, he meets with Richard Nixon, the US president, which was seen as an unbelievable act because this is in the deepest time of communist China and the Cold War. So that's a significant moment. Later, that leads to renewing of relations between the US and China officially in 1979. So even with China of today and its complicated and yet open relationship with the rest of the world, including the United States, you can find the roots of that in Mao's leadership and particularly, specifically, in the Cultural Revolution. And that's one of the great ironies of history, is that in this moment of the deepest moments of cultural revolution, of communist revolution, of the violence, of the internal violence, you also see the seeds being planted of the China that we have today, geopolitically, economically, militarily, etc.
But do you think today, when we see that cultural revolution is being removed from the historical memory of people, today in China you barely find anything you want to read about the cultural revolution in libraries or in areas of discourse? It's only being passed down by oral memory of people. And yet, Mao is everywhere. He's at the Tiananmen Square, he's at libraries, he's at bookstores, he's at schools, universities, and everywhere. Do you think that people want to remember him still as a godlike figure, but forget everything that he did?
I think we see that with a lot of leaders in history, where they are remembered in a very selective way. This is not just true in China, it's true of almost any country that I've seen, where leaders who become iconic, it's literally quite that. Sometimes it's just the icon without the substance or without the actual history. I think the Chinese have a euphemistic or kind of selective way of talking about the Cultural Revolution. If they do talk about it, it's very carefully. They talk about errors being committed. They talk about errors. They never denounced it. They never renounced it. They never talked about it as something that should not have happened. I think they just tried to talk about it as something, philosophically, just accepting that it happened and that it helped to make China of today, but without going into too much detail. So yes, we have the contradiction there of this mass suffering that happened in the Cultural Revolution, while at the same time Mao is still revered as a national leader. It's still one of the most perplexing things about understanding China today. I think it's actually interesting. I will sometimes hear from people of that generation, I know they went through the Cultural Revolution, but they're with us, and so I ask sometimes, how was it? And often they'll say, oh, it was very interesting, very nice. I learned a lot. I went to the countryside and learned how to dig ditches and build canals and things like that. And so I think, and these are people who are the ones who survived the Cultural Revolution and to some extent even benefited from it. The generation of today, including the people at the top leadership of China, are people who survived the Cultural Revolution. And so even if it was a difficult moment in Chinese history, for many individuals, it was actually a moment that helps explain their power today. And so why wouldn't they have a decent memory of the Cultural Revolution? It's something from which they personally benefited.
Now comes the Mao's advisors. Were they also completely in agreement with all his ideas? The four, the five, the committees, and all the people who were there with Mao leading the nation. Do you think that at some point they were hesitant and they wanted to stop the Cultural Revolution? And what happened after Mao died?
Well, that's a complicated question because there were many people involved. I would say originally this was really Mao's initiative. And I don't think that his subordinates or the people right under him had any appetite for the Cultural Revolution. And in fact, some of them were the first victims of the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution was very much turned against exactly the sort of people that were around Mao who would have been against the Cultural Revolution. But of course, the Cultural Revolution also wound up turning against people who had supported the Cultural Revolution. This is the nature of such events. Similar things happened also in the Soviet Union, in the era of Stalin, and so on. And I think there were also, on the other hand, people like, the Gang of Four, the Gang of Five. These are phenomena that happen when, especially with young people, and then Mao's younger wife, the last wife, was seen as the most extreme leader of the Cultural Revolution. In fact, even after Mao was trying to wind it down, they were continuing it, and they were even more gung-ho than Mao had been originally. So that's another thing that happened, and where you see people who actually support the Cultural Revolution and want to go even further. But I think that eventually there was such exhaustion from the experience of the Cultural Revolution that by the time Mao died in 1976, it was over. It was clear that this was over. And in fact, Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, had been purged by Mao and had barely survived the Cultural Revolution. And he was the one who really then moved away from this kind of politics into a much more conciliatory, development-oriented, governance-oriented leadership that was much more focused on foreign relations, especially building the relationship with the United States, which became very important to China. And we have to remember also China was a desperately poor country, one of the poorest in the world, and it was seen as a basket case also. That it had no hope. So I think we can't even all the economic side of things and the political side of things and the global side of things and China, all the debates we're having about is the Chinese economy in crisis, is China going this way or that way, what is China's relationship with India, what is China's relationship with the United States. We wouldn't even be having any of these debates without the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. None of these things were relevant back then. Nobody took China's economy into account. China's economy had no significance in 1976 for the global economy the way it does now. And so I think China's power, China's importance is also a result of the leaders that came after Mao kind of going in a very specific direction that was, if you will, a reaction to what they had gone through in the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution is a very important moment in Chinese history.
In your personal opinion, do you believe that the end justifies the means, and so Maoism is not a dangerous ideology if it took China to where it is today? Then there are people who still believe in Maoism and Maoist ideologies and Maoist principles and in the principles of revolution. Do you think that is justified?
Well, I think that really depends on what is the end that you're talking about. Did the end justify the means, and then what are the means? One of the reasons that I am a professor of history and leadership, and maybe not a national or world leader, is that I have no stomach for the kinds of things that leaders do sometimes in order to achieve their goals. I'm a much more mild-mannered, I have a sensitive stomach, as it will. I can't do such things. But I also realize that in history, especially with a country like China, it would be inconceivable to think of truly transformational change from where China was 100 years ago, completely under the control of foreign powers, to where it is today, without considering Mao's role. So in that sense, it's not for me to judge whether the ends justify the means, but really to understand history as the result of these events. And so, and many countries who became independent, sovereign, who were under colonial control, also had huge sacrifice. Millions of people who died in whether it was anti-colonial wars or wars of liberation or revolutionary wars and so on. So I think that that's one thing to take into account, is that that's simply how history has worked for most of these countries. And I think the Chinese people are very aware of that. I think that part of why they still revere Mao, despite everything that happened, is that they're aware of where China stands today versus where it stood 100 years ago. Or even 50 years ago. Second thing I think to take into account is that it really depends on what if the people benefit from it. I'm not sure that the Cultural Revolution led to anything good per se. It didn't really develop the country. It didn't really give the Chinese people good things. It caused the suffering. It was a disaster in many ways. As I said before, I don't consider Mao to be a great national leader. I do consider him to be an important revolutionary leader, and that's why I think those are two different things. But I also think, again, that we have to understand what happened to China after the Cultural Revolution as inexplicable without the Cultural Revolution. So as a historian, I tend not to sit too much in judgment of what happened, because I think ultimately it depends on what the country gets, what the people get. Now, China has done something which is very impressive, relatively speaking, which is that it has done this major lifting out of poverty. Now, there is still poverty in China, and China is still a very unequal society, economically speaking, especially with the urban and rural divide that exists in China, which is remarkable. And it's not just China that has this issue, as we know. There are many other countries that have this similar problem, but it's really almost impossible to compare the China of today in that sense from the China before Mao was in power, or in his early days of power. And so China sits before us as a very difficult case to assess, because on the one hand we admire them for their transformation, for their success, for the way that they have really built themselves up into a power that they were not just some decades ago. And that's a simple fact that everybody has to take into account. But on the other hand, we also stand horrified before the way that they, govern their country internally, the way that they talk about the way in which they treat their own population, dissent, the way they treat minorities sometimes, and also their very difficult and sometimes poor and hostile relations with their neighbors, and the sense that it is once again becoming in some ways a Maoist state in its authoritarianism. And so that's the complexity of history, that things are a combination of positive and negative, things that we might like and things that we don't like. And as for Maoism around the world, that's another factor which is very important. There are Maoist groups all over the world. They call themselves Maoist, but they're not Mao. They're Maoist. That's number one. The second is that it doesn't always mean that they want to have a cultural revolution or that they want to do exactly what Mao did as a national leader. I think they talk about Maoism more in the spirit of what kind of society they would like. And we have to remember that at base, what Mao was talking about is still ultimately very compelling and appealing to many people, because he's talking about a classless society. He's talking about a society in which all people can prosper and thrive, in which all people can find joy in their national pride, in which there are no natural or accepted divisions between the rich and the poor, in which everybody is freed, men, women, different ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. Whether that vision is actually a reality in China today, that is highly skeptical. But I think that we have to understand that a lot of these groups that call themselves Maoist are inspired by that original vision, I think, that Mao laid forth.
Thank you so much, Professor Temkin, for this informative interview. And for all those people who are trying to understand China today, you must understand what Chinese history has been, and Chinese history is incomplete without studying Mao and the Cultural Revolution.